I'm Maya. I'm 28, and my father looked me dead in the eye at Sunday dinner and said, "You're just a waitress, nothing more. When are you going to get a real job?" 3 hours later, when Tony Martinelli introduced me to the entire family as the woman who owns his restaurant and 14 others across Chicago, the marinara sauce literally fell from my dad's fork onto his pressed khaki pants. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The fluorescent lights above Martinelli's Italian kitchen cast that familiar warm glow over the red checkered tablecloths. The same glow I'd been working under for what my family believed was 8 long years of barely scraping by. The restaurant hummed with its usual Sunday evening energy, the clatter of plates mixing with conversations in 3 different languages, the scent of garlic and basil hanging thick in the air like a comforting blanket. This place had become my second home, though for reasons my family could never have imagined. I was carrying a tray of steaming lasagna to table 12 when I spotted them through the front window. My stomach immediately knotted. There was my father, Robert Rodriguez, adjusting his tie like he was walking into a business meeting instead of a neighborhood Italian joint. Behind him, my mother Linda clutched her purse against her side, her lips already pursed in that expression. I knew meant she was preparing to be disappointed by something. And bringing up the rear was my older brother Jake, checking his phone with that practiced air of someone whose time was far too valuable for family dinners. They were early. I had specifically told them 7:30, knowing the Sunday dinner rush would be winding down by then, giving us a quieter corner where we could eat without the usual chaos. But here they were at 6:45, right in the middle of the storm. And I was still in my server's apron, with marinara stains on my white button-down shirt. Tony Martinelli emerged from behind the host stand, his broad smile cutting through my anxiety like it always did. Tony was 63 years old, built like a linebacker who'd discovered the joy of his own cooking, with silver hair that never seemed to stay in place and hands that told stories of 4 decades in restaurant kitchens. To anyone watching, he was my boss, the man who signed my paychecks and told me which tables needed water refills. The irony of that perception never stopped being surreal. "The Rodriguez family," Tony announced with genuine warmth, extending his hand to my father. "You must be Maya's papa. She talks about you all the time." My father shook Tony's hand with the kind of firm grip he reserved for people he was trying to impress, though his eyes were already scanning the restaurant with barely concealed judgment. I could practically hear his thoughts. "This is where my daughter wastes her life. It's a cramped neighborhood spot with its mismatched chairs and faded photographs of Sicily on the walls." "Robert Rodriguez," my father said, his voice carrying that tone he used when he wanted people to know he was important. "Thank you for employing our Maya. I know she's learning." The condescension in his voice hit me like a slap learning, as if I were some college dropout, fumbling through life with no direction. No purpose, no value beyond the ability to balance plates on my arm. I caught Tony's eyes, and something passed between us, a look that said everything and nothing. He knew how those words landed, how they carved into me. But he also knew this wasn't the time or place to correct anyone's assumptions. "Right this way," Tony said, leading them to the corner booth I'd specifically requested. "Maya will be right with you." I watched my family settle into the booth, Jake immediately pulling out his phone while my parents surveyed their surroundings. Like tourists in a foreign country? My mother's fingers traced the edge of the laminated menu, with the kind of delicate touch you'd use on something you weren't sure was clean. My father loosened his tie slightly, a gesture that somehow managed to convey both relaxation and superiority. At the same time, this was supposed to be a simple family dinner. I had invited them here to Martinelli's because I wanted them to see me in my element, to understand that my work had value, even if they couldn't see past the uniform. But standing there with my order pad in my hand, watching them settle into their seats with expressions that ranged from polite tolerance to outright embarrassment, I realized how foolish that hope had been. Jake looked up from his phone long enough to wave me over. "Hey sis, could we get some water started? Maybe see if they have anything on the menu that isn't swimming in cheese?" The casual dismissal in his voice, the way he addressed me, like any other server, rather than his sister, crystallized something inside me. This wasn't just about dinner. This was about 8 years of carefully constructed assumptions. 8 years of them believing they knew exactly who I was and what my life amounted to. They saw the apron and the name tag, and that was enough. They never asked questions that went deeper than whether I was making rent or if I'd finally come to my senses, about finding a real career, what they didn't know, what they couldn't possibly imagine as they sat there pitying my life choices, was that the woman refilling their water glasses owned a restaurant empire worth $47 million. I set down their water glasses with the practiced efficiency of someone who had done this thousands of times, though the reasons for that efficiency were far more complex than they realized. My mother smiled at me with that tight, sympathetic expression she reserved for situations where she felt sorry for someone, but didn't want to show it to, obviously. "Honey," she said, her voice carrying that particular tone mothers use when they're about to deliver unwelcome advice disguised as concern. "Your father and I have been talking, and we think it might be time to consider some other options. Jake knows someone at his firm who might be able to get you an entry-level position. Nothing glamorous, mind you, but it would be a start toward something more substantial." The word substantial hung in the air between us like smoke from a grease fire. I could feel Tony watching from behind the host's stand, his expression carefully neutral, but I knew him well enough to recognize the slight tightening around his eyes. He had heard this conversation before, or variations of it, during the handful of times my family had ventured into his restaurant over the years. Each time, they spoke about my future as if I weren't standing right there, as if my life were a problem to be solved rather than a path I had chosen. "That's very thoughtful," I said, my voice steady despite the familiar burn of frustration rising in my chest. "But I'm actually doing quite well here," Jake snorted, not bothering to look up from his phone. "You're 28 years old. You can't serve pasta for the rest of your life. At some point, you need to think about building something real, something that matters, something that matters." The phrase echoed in my mind as I mechanically straightened the salt and pepper shakers on their table. If only he knew that 3 blocks away, in a converted warehouse that had once housed a textile factory, sat the headquarters of Horizon Hospitality Group. If only he could see the glass-walled conference room where I had spent yesterday morning reviewing expansion plans for our newest location in Milwaukee. If only he understood that the something real he was lecturing me about was already built, was already thriving, already employing over 400 people across the Midwest. But Jake saw the black slacks and the white shirt with the small marinara, staying near the 3rd button, and that was the extent of his vision. He saw his little sister who had somehow lost her way after high school, who had chosen the service industry over college, who had disappointed their parents' dreams of having 2 successful professional children. What he didn't see was the woman, who had started with a single food truck at 20, had turned it into an empire that generated more revenue in a month than his law firm saw in a year. My father cleared his throat, drawing my attention back to the moment. "Maya, sit down for a minute. I need to have a serious conversation." I glanced around the restaurant. It was approaching 7 o'clock now, and the dinner rush was beginning. Too slow. Most of my tables had either finished their meals or were lingering over wine and conversation. Tony caught my eye and nodded slightly, a gesture that told me he could handle things for a few minutes if I needed to focus on my family. I slid into the booth beside my mother, the vinyl squeaking softly under my weight. The familiar sounds of the restaurant continued around us, the gentle clinking of glasses, the murmur of satisfied diners, the occasional burst of laughter from the bar area. This place had become a sanctuary for me over the years, not because I needed the job, but because it reminded me where I had started, kept me grounded in the reality of what hospitality truly meant. "Your mother and I have been patient," my father began, his hands folded on the table in front of him like he was conducting a business meeting. "We understood that you needed some time to figure things out after high school. But it's been 10 years, Maya. 10 years of watching you pour coffee and clear tables while your brother has built a career, bought a house, started planning for his future." The comparison to Jake was inevitable. It always came back to Jake. With his law degree from Northwestern, his downtown office with the view of Lake Michigan, his wife Ashley, who worked in marketing for a pharmaceutical company. Jake was the success story, the child who had followed the prescribed path and reaped the prescribed rewards. I was the cautionary tale, the one who had chosen passion over pragmatism and was presumably paying the price. "I understand your concerns," I said carefully, choosing my words like I was navigating a minefield. "But you're making assumptions about my life that aren't necessarily accurate." My mother reached over and patted my hand with the kind of gentle condescension usually reserved for children who didn't understand why they couldn't have ice cream for dinner. "Sweetheart, we're not judging you. We know you work hard. But serving tables isn't a career, it's a job. There's a difference." The distinction she was drawing felt like a knife blade pressed against my throat. In her mind, there was clearly a hierarchy of human value, with lawyers and doctors and business executives at the top and service workers somewhere near the bottom. What she couldn't understand, what none of them could understand, was that I had chosen to work at Martinelli's, not out of necessity, but out of love for the industry that had given me everything. Jake finally looked up from his phone, his expression serious for the first time since they'd arrived. "Look, Maya, I get it. You like the restaurant business? But you're never going to own a place like this working as a server. You really want to stay in food service? At least think bigger? Maybe management or culinary school, or finding investors to start your own place?" His suggestion about finding investors struck me as particularly ironic, considering that the woman sitting across from him had personally invested over $12 million in restaurant acquisitions over the past 3 years. But I couldn't tell him that. Not yet, not here. The revelation I was planning required the right moment, the right setting, the right witnesses. "I appreciate the advice," I said, standing up from the booth. "But I think you're underestimating what's possible in this industry." My father's face hardened slightly, the way it always did when he felt his authority being questioned. "Maya, I'm not trying to hurt your feelings, but let's be realistic. You're a waitress. It's all you are, and that's all you're ever going to be if you don't make some changes." The words hit me like a physical blow, not because they were true, but because of the casual certainty with which he delivered them. In his world, my worth was determined by his ability to understand and categorize my choices. Since he couldn't see past the surface of what I did, he assumed there was nothing beneath it to see. Tony appeared at our table as if summoned by the tension in the air. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. His timing was perfect, as it always was. "Is everything okay over here?" "Maya. Table 6 is asking for you specifically. Mrs. Romano wants to compliment you on the wine recommendation." I nodded, grateful for the interruption. "I'll be right there." As I walked away from my family's table, I could hear my mother's voice carrying across the restaurant. "See what I mean? She's 28 years old and she's still getting excited about wine recommendations." What she didn't know was that the wine recommendation had come from my personal collection, a bottle from a vineyard in Tuscany that I had visited last year while researching locations for Horizon Hospitality's international expansion. What she didn't know was that Mrs. Romano wasn't just a regular customer, the grandmother of one of my sous chefs at Solace, and that her compliments meant more to me than any performance review Jake had ever received at his law firm. But those were details that would have to wait for another day, another conversation, another moment when the truth could finally surface. The rest of dinner unfolded like a slow-motion disaster. I moved between their table and my other customers, maintaining the professional smile that had become second nature over the years, while my family continued their intervention disguised as a meal. Every time I approached to refill water glasses or check on their entrees, the conversation would pause momentarily before resuming once I walked away, as if they were discussing a patient who couldn't be trusted with their own diagnosis. Jake had ordered the chicken parmesan, extra sauce on the side, no cheese touching the vegetables. Even his dinner order had to be controlled, customized, perfected according to his specifications. He ate with the mechanical efficiency of someone who viewed meals as fuel rather than experience, cutting precise squares and checking his phone between bites. Watching him, I remembered the kid who used to sneak into the kitchen when our mother wasn't looking, stealing spoonfuls of cookie dough and licking cake batter from mixing bowls. That curiosity, that joy in simple pleasures. had been replaced by someone who saw food as just another thing to optimize and manage. My mother picked at her capelline pomodoro, moving the pasta around her plate more than actually eating it. She had always been like this at restaurants. Suspicious of portions she hadn't measured herself, skeptical of ingredients she hadn't personally selected. Even now, she was examining each forkful as if it might contain evidence of my poor life. "Choices. This sauce is very rich," she announced to no one in particular. I suppose that's how they masked the quality of the ingredients. The comment was directed at me, though she didn't make eye contact when she said it. It was her way of expressing disapproval without being directly confrontational, a skill she had perfected over decades of suburban diplomacy. In her mind, my association with this place somehow reflected my own standards, my own willingness to settle for less than what she considered acceptable. My father, meanwhile, finished his veal marsala and was now studying the restaurant with the critical eye of someone conducting an informal business assessment. I could see him calculating table turnover rates, estimating profit margins, forming opinions about the efficiency of the operation. "This place seems busy enough," he said, his tone suggesting surprise that a neighborhood restaurant could sustain itself. "I suppose there's always a market for comfort food, even if the margins aren't great." His casual dismissal of Tony's life work. Of the 37 years Tony had spent building Martinelli's from a small storefront into one of Lincoln Park's most beloved institutions, sparked something fierce inside me. This wasn't just a restaurant to Tony. It was a legacy, a love letter to his grandmother's recipes, a place where 3 generations of families had celebrated birthdays and anniversaries and quiet Tuesday night dinners. "The margins are actually quite good," I said, unable to keep the edge out of my voice. "When you focus on quality ingredients and authentic preparation, customers are willing to pay for the experience." Jake looked up from his phone with barely concealed amusement. "Maya, you're talking like you understand the business side of things. You realize there's a difference between serving the food and actually running a restaurant, right?" Condescension. And his voice was so thick I could have cut it with a bread knife. In his world, understanding was something that came with degrees and certifications, not with experience and intuition. The idea that I might have insights into restaurant operations, beyond what I could observe from the dining room floor, was apparently too absurd to consider seriously. "I pick things up," I said simply, refilling his water glass with perhaps more force than necessary. My mother reached across the table and touched my arm, her expression softening into what she probably thought was maternal concern. "Honey, we're not trying to make you feel bad about your choices. We just want you to understand that you have options. You're smart, you're personable, you could do anything you set your mind to. It breaks our hearts to see you limiting yourself. Like this, limiting myself." The phrase echoed in my mind as I watched her face, saw the genuine worry mixed with disappointment in her eyes. She truly believed that my life was small, constrained, defined by the boundaries of what she could see and understand. The woman who had raised me, who had taught me to dream big and work hard, couldn't recognize that I had done exactly what she had encouraged me to do. The irony was crushing. 24 hours ago, I had been in a conference call with investors in New York, discussing a potential partnership that would bring Horizon Hospitality into the Manhattan market. Last week, I had flown to Portland to finalize the acquisition of a boutique hotel that would become our first venture outside the restaurant space. 2 days from now, I was scheduled to meet with the mayor's office about a development project that would revitalize an entire neighborhood on the south side. But sitting in that booth, watching my family's faces as they discussed my future, I wasn't present. I felt smaller than I had in years, not because their opinions changed who I was or what I had accomplished, but because the distance between their perception and my reality had grown so vast that I wasn't sure it could ever be bridged. Tony appeared at our table again, this time carrying a small plate of cannoli. "Compliments of the house," he said with his characteristic warmth. "Maya told me you were celebrating something special tonight." I hadn't told Tony any such thing, but he had a gift for reading situations and knowing exactly what people needed, even when they didn't know it themselves. The gesture was perfectly timed, a moment of sweetness to cut through the tension that had been building all evening. My father accepted the plate with the kind of stiff gratitude he reserved for service. He felt obligated to acknowledge but didn't particularly appreciate. "That's very kind, but unnecessary. We're happy to pay for our dessert." No payment necessary, Tony replied, his smile never wavering. Maya has been like family to us for years. Her family is our family. The words hung in the air like an invitation to see me differently, to recognize that I had built meaningful relationships in this world they dismissed so casually. But I could see in their faces that the message wasn't landing. Tony's kindness was just another example of the service industry's tendency toward false familiarity. Another reason why I needed to move beyond this world into something more substantial. Jake bit into his cannoli, and for just a moment, his expression softened. Okay, this is actually incredible, he admitted, almost reluctantly. Where do you get these? Maria makes them fresh every morning, I said. She's been with us for 15 years. Her grandmother's recipe from Sicily. Us, Jake repeated, seizing on the word like a prosecutor spotting an inconsistency in testimony. Maya, you're not part of the us here. You work here. There's a difference. The correction felt like a slap. In his mind, I was playing dress-up, pretending to belong to something that would never truly accept me as more than an employee. What he couldn't understand was that the U.S. I was referring to went far deeper than he could imagine, encompassed more restaurants, more employees, more responsibility than he dealt with in his corner office overlooking the lake. As the evening wound down and my family prepared to leave, the weight of their disappointment settled over the table like a heavy blanket. They left cash for the bill, despite my insistence that Tony would never accept payment from my family, and gathered their coats with the resigned air of people who had done their duty but expected no gratitude for their efforts. Think about what we discussed tonight, my father said as he stood to leave. You have one life, Maya. Don't waste it. I watched them walk toward the door, three people who loved me deeply but understood me not at all. They saw a 20-year-old, a woman with no clear direction, no substantial achievements, no future beyond the next shift and the next tip. They saw someone who needed saving from herself, rescuing from choices that made no sense to them. What they didn't see was the woman who would change everything they thought they knew about success, failure, and the true meaning of building something that mattered. The following Tuesday morning found me standing in the gleaming kitchen of Solace, my flagship restaurant in River North, watching David Park run through the weekly inventory reports. The contrast between this space and Martinelli's couldn't have been more stark. Where Tony's kitchen was warm and lived in, with copper pots bearing the patina of decades of use, Solace was all surgical steel and precision engineering. Every surface reflected the morning light streaming through floor-to-ceiling windows. The silence was broken only by the soft hum of state-of-the-art refrigeration units and David's measured voice as he detailed our food costs down to the penny. David had been with me for 3 years, recruited from a high-end consulting firm after I watched him turn around a failing restaurant chain in Minneapolis. He was everything I wasn't, organizationally speaking, methodical where I was intuitive, conservative where I was willing to take risks, diplomatic where I tended toward bluntness. He also happened to be one of only 4 people in the world who knew that Maya Rodriguez, part-time server at Martinelli's Italian Kitchen, and Maya Rodriguez, founder and CEO of Horizon Hospitality Group, were the same person. The numbers from Sunday are interesting, David said, sliding a tablet across the stainless steel prep counter. Martinelli's had their highest single-day revenue in 6 months. Tony mentioned your family came in for dinner. I glanced at the report, though I knew the numbers by heart. Every restaurant in the Horizon portfolio generated detailed analytics that I reviewed each morning over coffee. Martinelli's had been part of my holdings for 2 years now, though Tony believed he was simply leasing his space from a property management company that happened to be very understanding about late payments and necessary renovations. The fiction allowed him to maintain his pride while giving me the ability to ensure that one of Chicago's most authentic family restaurants would never close due to financial pressures. They had opinions about the place, I said, accepting the espresso that David had prepared without being asked, and nothing surprising. David studied my face with the careful attention of someone who had learned to read the subtle signs of my moods. He was 34, Korean American, with an MBA from Wharton and the kind of analytical mind that could spot problems 3/4 before they became apparent to anyone else. He was also patient in a way that I envied, capable of waiting. for the right moment to ask the questions that needed asking. "Your brother still doesn't know," he said. It wasn't a question. "Jake thinks I'm a waitress who's never going to amount to anything," I replied, sipping the espresso and feeling the familiar burn of caffeine and frustration. "My parents think I'm wasting my life serving other people's food. They've offered to help me find a real job at least 6 times in the past month." The irony wasn't lost on either of us. While Jake was billing hours at his law firm, proud of his 6-figure salary and his partnership track, I was quietly building something that generated more revenue in a quarter than his entire firm saw in a year. While my parents worried about my lack of health insurance and retirement planning, I was sitting on assets that could fund their retirement 10 times over. "The Portland deal is closing on Friday," David said, seamlessly shifting into business mode. "The Seattle location is already showing positive cash flow in month 2. Denver wants to expand their patio seating for summer, and Milwaukee is asking about adding a weekend brunch menu." These were the details that filled my real life, the decisions that occupied my actual time and energy. Each restaurant in the Horizon family was a carefully considered addition to our portfolio, chosen not just for its potential profitability, but for its contribution to the communities we served. We didn't buy restaurants to flip them or strip them for parts. We acquired them to help them become the best versions of themselves. "What about the insurance claim on the Lincoln Park location?" I asked, referring to a small cafe that had suffered water damage during the spring floods. "Approved and paid out. We'll reopen next month with the new flooring and updated kitchen equipment. The staff has been working at our other locations, so no one lost wages during the closure." This was the kind of detail that mattered to me, the human element that made the business personal rather than just profitable. When we acquired struggling restaurants, we weren't just buying assets. We were becoming responsible for the livelihoods of servers and cooks and dishwashers who depended on those paychecks to feed their own families. My phone buzzed with a text from Emma Chen, my best friend since culinary school, and the only person who truly understood the weight of keeping such a massive secret from my family. "Coffee later? I have news about the investor meeting." Emma ran her own catering company, specializing in high-end corporate events, and we often collaborated on larger projects. She was also the closest thing I had to a sister, someone who had watched me build Horizon from a single food truck into an empire while simultaneously watching me endure years of family dinners where my accomplishments were invisible. "Emma wants to meet this afternoon," I told David, "probably about the Michigan Avenue project." The Michigan Avenue project was my most ambitious undertaking yet, a 3-story restaurant complex that would house an upscale dining room, a casual cafe, and a rooftop bar, all connected by a central kitchen that could supply all 3 concepts. The investment required was substantial, but the potential impact on Chicago's dining scene was even more significant.
Right.
That would put Horizon hospitality on the national map, the kind of move that would make it impossible to remain anonymous. "Speaking of visibility," David said carefully, "the Tribune wants to do a feature on Chicago's emerging restaurant groups. They specifically mentioned Horizon. I've been deflecting, but they're persistent." The media attention was inevitable. I knew that. As Horizon grew larger and more influential, maintaining anonymity became increasingly difficult. Food bloggers had started noticing patterns in our acquisitions. Business journalists were asking questions about the mysterious company behind some of the city's most successful restaurant turnarounds. And industry insiders were beginning to connect dots that I had tried to keep separate. "How much longer do you think we can keep this quiet?" I asked, though I suspected I already knew the answer. "Honestly, maybe 6 months, if we're lucky. The Michigan Avenue project is going to require building permits, liquor licenses, a dozen different regulatory approvals. Your name is going to be on documents that become public record, and if we're successful, which we will be, people are going to notice." I nodded, finishing my espresso and setting the cup down on the gleaming counter. The weight of the secret had been growing heavier each year. Not because I was ashamed of what I had built, but because maintaining the fiction required constant vigilance. Every family dinner was a performance. Every conversation with my parents was an exercise in careful omission. Every interaction with Jake was a reminder of how completely he had misjudged my capabilities. "There's something else," David said, his tone suggesting that whatever he was about to share would complicate my life further. "Jake's firm is representing the developers on the Millennium Park project. They're looking for restaurant partners." The revelation hit me like cold water. Jake's law firm, the same firm where he spent 60 hours a week proving his worth, was working on a development that could potentially compete with our Michigan Avenue location. The irony was staggering. While he was lecturing me about the need to build something substantial, he was unknowingly working on a project that could impact the restaurant empire I had already built. "Do we know who the developers are?" I asked. "Meridian Properties. They've been circling the Chicago market for 2 years, looking for the right opportunity to establish a presence here. The Millennium Park location would be their flagship." I processed this information while staring out the windows of Solace, watching the morning commuter traffic navigate the streets below. In a few hours, I would put on my server's uniform and return to Martinelli's for the lunch shift, carrying plates and taking orders while my family continued to believe that this was the extent of my ambition. Meanwhile, the restaurant industry that they dismissed as beneath me was about to become a battlefield where their professional world and my hidden empire might collide. The complexity of maintaining this double life was reaching a breaking point. Each day brought new challenges that required decisions too significant to hide, opportunities too valuable to pass up, recognition too widespread to deflect. The careful balance I had maintained for 8 years was beginning to wobble. It got and I could feel the moment approaching when everything would come crashing down. What I couldn't predict was whether that moment would come as a planned revelation or an accidental discovery, whether I would control the narrative or become a victim of circumstances beyond my influence. 3 weeks later, the call came on a Thursday evening while I was closing out the register at Martinelli's. Tony had left early for his grandson's baseball game. I was alone in the restaurant, enjoying the peaceful quiet that settled over. The dining room after the last customer had departed. The chairs were stacked on tables, the floors mopped to a shine. The familiar scent of garlic and oregano hung in the air like a comfortable memory. My phone displayed Jake's name, which was unusual enough to make me pause. My brother rarely called unless there was a family emergency or he needed something specific. We had settled into a pattern of polite distance over the years, exchanging pleasantries at obligatory family gatherings, but rarely connecting on a deeper level. "Maya, I need to ask you something," Jake said without preamble, his voice carrying an urgency I hadn't heard since we were teenagers. "How well do you know the owners of the restaurants in your neighborhood?" The question caught me off guard, though I tried to keep my voice steady. "What do you mean?" "I'm working on this development project, and we're trying to identify potential restaurant partners. There's this company called Horizon Hospitality that keeps coming up. They own a bunch of places around the city, but nobody seems to know much about them. Very secretive, very private. I thought maybe you'd heard something through the grapevine." My heart began beating faster, though I forced myself to continue wiping down the bar with practiced calm. I might have heard the name mentioned. "Why?" "Because they're either brilliant or insane," Jake said, and I could hear the frustration in his voice. "They've been acquiring restaurants left and right, but instead of maximizing profits, they seem to be focused on some kind of community development angle. Better wages, local sourcing, affordable pricing. It doesn't make business sense, but somehow they're making it work." The irony of my brother describing my business philosophy as potentially insane wasn't lost on me. Jake had always believed that success meant extracting maximum value from every opportunity. That sentiment was the enemy of smart business decisions. The idea that someone could build a profitable company while prioritizing people over profits was apparently beyond his comprehension. "Maybe they just have a different approach," I suggested carefully. "Different doesn't begin to cover it," Jake continued. "We've been trying to get a meeting with their leadership for months. Our clients want to partner with them for the Millennium Park project, but Horizon won't even return our calls. It's like they don't want to make money." I almost laughed at that assessment. Horizon Hospitality was generating more revenue than Jake's law firm, but we were selective about our partnerships. The Millennium Park project represented everything I opposed about modern restaurant development: generic concepts designed to maximize tourist dollars rather than serve communities. corporate ownership that prioritized shareholders over employees, and a philosophy that treated food as a commodity rather than culture. Maybe they're just busy, I said, continuing to clean while my mind raced through the implications of this conversation. That's what I thought initially, but then I started digging deeper. Maya, this company is massive. They own 15 restaurants. Across 3 states, they're planning some kind of huge expansion in River North. And nobody knows who's actually running the show. The business filings all lead back to shell corporations and legal entities that don't reveal anything useful. The shell corporations had been David's idea, a way to maintain privacy while we built the company. At the time, it had seemed like a reasonable precaution against competitors and media attention. Listening to Jake's frustration with our deliberately opaque structure, I realized how effectively we had succeeded in hiding our true scope. "Have you tried reaching out directly to their restaurants?" I asked, genuinely curious about his investigative process. That's the weird part. Every manager I've spoken with claims they're just employees. They don't have any contact information for corporate leadership. Either this company has the most compartmentalized structure I've ever seen, or everyone is lying. Neither was exactly accurate, but both were close enough to the truth to make me smile. The managers at our restaurants were employees, but they were also partners in the sense that they had equity stakes in their locations and significant autonomy in daily operations. They genuinely didn't have direct access to me in my role as CEO, though they could reach me through David if necessary. "Jake, why are you asking me about this?" There was a pause, and when he spoke again, his voice carried a different quality. Something that might have been respect, if I hadn't known better. "Because you work in this industry, and you pay attention to things, you might have insights that we're missing. This Horizon company is either going to be our biggest opportunity or our biggest obstacle, and I need to understand which one it is." The moment felt surreal, standing in the empty restaurant where my family believed I was wasting my life.
Listening to my brother.
Ask for my professional advice about the company I had built. He needed my expertise, even if he didn't realize the true extent of what I knew. "What if I told you that Horizon probably isn't interested in your project because they have different priorities?" I said slowly, "What if they're building something that's about more than just making money? Then I'd say they won't survive in this market," Jake replied without hesitation. "Good intentions don't pay rent or cover payroll. At some point, every business has to face reality," his certainty. His absolute conviction that my approach was doomed to failure crystallized something inside me. For 8 years, I had listened to my family's assessments of my limitations. Their predictions about my future, their well-intentioned advice about the need to be more realistic. But sitting there in Tony's restaurant, surrounded by the evidence of what passion and integrity could build when combined with business acumen, I realized that the time for hiding was coming to an end. "You might be surprised," I said quietly. "Sometimes the most successful businesses are the ones that understand success differently." Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.